March 15th, 1957. Editorial Office of Industrial America Magazine, Detroit, Michigan. Vernon Thaddeus Holbrook opened the manila envelope and froze. Inside lay a manuscript of memoirs, 300 pages of typescript, and a cover letter from the publishing house requesting a review. The author? Aldrich Morrison Cavanaugh, former director of the Detroit Precision Engineering Corporation, recipient of the Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Production. Vernon read the name again and again until the letters blurred before his eyes. 14 years he'd waited for this moment. 14 years, 3 months, and 8 days, since the day his father walked out through the factory gates under security escort, like a common criminal. The hand holding the letter trembled slightly. Outside the editorial office window, a cold March rain pelted the pavement. But Vernon noticed neither the weather nor the receptionist calling his name twice. He stared at the photograph on the manuscript cover, a distinguished gray-haired man with a row of war service ribbons on his lapel, and thought about how this man had killed his father. Slowly, methodically, absolutely legally. The manuscript was titled, quote, _2___. Vernon opened the first page. The text began with a patriotic preamble about America's industrial might, about production miracles and meeting delivery quotas for the war effort. Standard rhetoric that Vernon would recognize blindfolded. He'd edited hundreds of such pieces during his 6 years working in trade publishing. But now every word about quote 3 and quote 4 cut like a blade. He flipped several pages and landed on a chapter titled quote 5. There, among general reflections about the importance of employee loyalty, appeared this sentence. __, quote _6___. Vernon slammed the manuscript shut. A metallic taste filled his mouth. From the bottom desk drawer, he pulled out a battered cardboard folder tied with faded ribbon. Inside were documents his mother had kept for 20 years, and for the past 3 years, he himself. A personnel file, a copy of the termination notice, a memo from company headquarters, and letters. Dozens of letters his father had written to various authorities trying to restore justice. All stamped __, quote _7__. Vernon sat at his desk for a long time, the manuscript before him, the folder of documents beside it. 2 versions of history. One polished, self-serving, destined for publication. The other, raw, painful, buried in a filing cabinet for 14 years. He thought about his mother, Constance, who died 2 years ago without ever seeing her husband's name cleared. She'd worked herself into an early grave at that laundry, her hands permanently reddened from harsh detergents, her back bent from years of lifting heavy loads. On her deathbed, she'd gripped Vernon's hand and whispered, "Promise me you'll tell the truth about your father. Don't let them remember him the way Cavanaugh wanted him remembered. Promise me." He'd promised. And now, holding Cavanaugh's lies in his hands, he knew exactly what he had to do. April 12, 1943, Detroit Precision Engineering Corporation, Detroit, Michigan. Thaddeus Barnwell Holbrook, Chief of Quality Assurance, 41 years old, sat in the director's office and couldn't comprehend what was happening. Before him on the desk lay a sheet of paper, a personnel evaluation signed by Cavanaugh. Thaddeus read the text a second time, and with each word, reality became more distorted, as though he'd fallen into some absurd nightmare. Quote _9__, Cavanaugh sat behind a massive desk piled with folders and engineering drawings, studying Thaddeus with a heavy, appraising gaze. He was 50 years old, a large face with fleshy jowls, graying hair combed straight back. On his lapel, an Army-Navy quote 10-pin for excellence in war production. Behind him on the wall hung framed photographs. Cavanaugh shaking hands with military brass, Cavanaugh receiving awards, Cavanaugh standing beside newly manufactured turbines destined for B-17 bombers. A shrine to his own importance. Thaddeus placed the evaluation back on the desk, trying to keep his voice steady. Cavanaugh interrupted him bluntly, without preliminaries. Quote, 14. Thaddeus blinked in confusion. Quote, 15. Quote, 16. Cavanaugh cut him off. Quote, 17. Quote, 18. Thaddeus's voice rose despite himself. Microfractures in the heat-affected zones. If those turbines had gone into aircraft engines, the thermal cycling would have propagated those cracks. Within 6 months, maybe less, we'd have had catastrophic failures at altitude. Pilots could have died. You're not a safety engineer qualified to make such determinations. Cavanaugh stood up from behind the desk. He was a head taller than Thaddeus, heavy, dominating with his bulk. You're a quality inspector. Your job is to stamp documents. I make the decisions. Understood? Silence hung in the air. Beyond the office window on the 5th floor of the administrative building, the factory yard was visible. Smokestacks from the machine shops belching dark smoke into the April sky. Overhead cranes swinging loads of raw steel. Warehouses stacked with components waiting for assembly. Thaddeus had worked here half his life. He'd arrived as a 22-year-old veteran of the Great War, still carrying shrapnel in his left shoulder from the Meuse-Argonne offensive, started as a floor inspector making 35 cents an hour, climbed the ladder through depression and recovery. Here he'd met Constance, a shy bookkeeper with gentle eyes who'd brought him coffee during a late-night inventory check in 1926. Here their son Vernon was born. In the company hospital in 1927, a squalling, red-faced infant who'd grown into a serious, thoughtful boy. This plant was his life. Every bolt, every weld, every inspection stamp carried his professional pride. I'll file a grievance with the union, Thaddeus said quietly. I have seniority rights. I'm entitled to a hearing before the shop stewards. Cavanaugh smirked. Go ahead. Just understand, your evaluation is already at company headquarters in New York. I spoke personally with Harrington, the vice president for personnel. He's aware of the situation. He agrees with my assessment. So file away. Knock yourself out. Thaddeus walked out of the office on unsteady legs. In the corridor stood the director's secretary, Mildred, a plump woman around 45, usually cheerful and chatty, always ready with neighborhood gossip and updates about her grandchildren. Now she averted her eyes as Thaddeus passed. Didn't look at him. Didn't say hello. Didn't acknowledge his existence. And that's when he understood it was over. Whatever Cavanaugh had set in motion couldn't be stopped. The machinery of institutional power was already grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. That evening, Holbrook residence, Northwest Detroit. Thaddeus sat at the kitchen table, staring at the termination notice. The paper seemed to pulse with malevolent energy under the overhead light. Constance stood by the stove, one hand covering her mouth, the other gripping the counter for support. Vernon, 16 years old, a high school junior with his father's serious demeanor and his mother's dark eyes, stood in the doorway watching his father with wide, frightened eyes. The kitchen smelled of the pot roast Constance had been preparing, a Friday tradition, something to look forward to at the end of a long work week. Now the meal sat forgotten, cooling on the stovetop, as the family's entire world tilted on its axis. Thaddeus said hollowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Constance's voice was barely audible, threaded through with terror. She knew what unemployment meant. They'd survived the depression by the skin of their teeth, watching neighbors lose everything, standing in bread lines, making soup from scraps. The steady paycheck from Detroit Precision had been their salvation. Vernon interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. Thaddeus looked at his son, tall for his age, already nearly 6 feet, serious beyond his years, with Constance's dark eyes and sharp features that made him look older than 16. Smart kid. Top of his class at Northwestern High, editor of the school newspaper, already talking about studying journalism at Wayne State. Vernon deserved to understand what was happening, deserved to see how power worked in the real world. Because I made him look bad, son. 3 months ago, we had a production meeting. Cavanaugh wanted to cut corners on heat treatment procedures. Specifically, He wanted to reduce the tempering time from 8 hours to 2 hours per batch. It would save 6 hours per batch, let us push through 3 batches a day instead of 2. On paper, it made sense. Increased output, faster delivery, happier customers. But I said it would compromise the metal integrity. The turbine housings operate under extreme thermal stress. Inadequate heat treatment means inadequate grain structure in the steel, which means reduced tensile strength, which means potential catastrophic failure under operational loads. Vernon nodded slowly, absorbing the technical details. So you said no? I said no. And Cavanaugh overruled me in front of the entire engineering staff, made it clear that my opinion didn't matter, that production quotas trumped safety concerns. So, I did what the company manual says to do in such situations. I documented my objection in writing. Detailed technical analysis, stress calculations, failure probability estimates. And then I sent a copy to the Army inspection team that oversees our contracts, because that's what the regulations require. Quality Assurance has a legal obligation to report safety concerns directly to the contracting authority. You went over his head, Vernon said slowly, beginning to understand. I followed proper safety protocols. The Army inspectors agreed with me. They brought in their own metallurgists, ran their own tests, confirmed my analysis. They ordered Cavanaugh to maintain the full 8-hour heat treatment cycle. No shortcuts. Full compliance with specifications. Cavanaugh had to eat crow in front of the War Production Board, had to admit his proposal was technically unsound. He's been looking for a way to get rid of me ever since. But that's wrong. You did the right thing. You probably saved lives. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything, Vernon. Remember that. Remember this moment. Because you're going to face choices like this in your life. Moments when doing what's right conflicts with doing what's easy or profitable or politically convenient. And you need to decide, right now, what kind of man you're going to be. Vernon stood straighter, his jaw set. I want to be like you, Dad. Spring 1943. Thaddeus Holbrook filed a grievance with the United Auto Workers Local 412. The union representative, a well-meaning man named Patrick Sullivan with thinning red hair and a perpetually worried expression, listened sympathetically and promised to investigate. 2 weeks later, Sullivan called Thaddeus to a meeting at the Union Hall on Michigan Avenue, a drafty building that smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. They sat in Sullivan's cramped office, surrounded by filing cabinets stuffed with grievance forms and contract disputes. Thaddeus's voice was flat, emotionless. He'd expected this, but the confirmation still hurt. __quote_40___. Thaddeus tried the War Labor Board next, filled out the forms in triplicate, filed a formal complaint alleging wrongful termination, violations of seniority provisions, retaliation for reporting safety concerns. 6 months later, he received a form letter on official government letterhead. __quote_42___. He wrote to his congressman, William Broomfield, a Republican representing Michigan's 18th district, composed a careful 3-page letter explaining the situation, emphasizing his war service, his work record, the technical validity of his safety concerns. Got back a polite response 3 weeks later thanking him for his service to the war effort and suggesting he seek employment at another defense contractor where his skills would be appreciated. He applied to 12 different plants: Packard Motor Company, Chrysler Tank Arsenal, Ford's Willow Run Bomber Plant, smaller machine shops and fabrication facilities throughout the Detroit area. Every application required references from previous employers. Every time, the same result. __quote_43___. Or sometimes, more honestly, __quote_44___. The word had spread through Detroit's tight-knit industrial community. Thaddeus Holbrook was a troublemaker, a man who wouldn't follow orders, a man who'd go over his boss's head to outside authorities. In wartime America, when industrial discipline was considered essential to victory, that was worse than being incompetent. It made you suspect. It made you dangerous. It made you unemployable. 1944 to 1947. Thaddeus found work where he could. Assembly line jobs at small shops that didn't require references, where they needed bodies and didn't ask too many questions. Loading docks at warehouses. Night watchman positions at parking garages and storage facilities. Nothing that used his engineering knowledge, nothing that drew on 20 years of quality control experience. The jobs paid poorly and offered no security. He was always the first fired when contracts ended or business slowed. The family moved from their comfortable two-story house in northwest Detroit, a home they'd bought in 1935 with a mortgage they'd been steadily paying down, to a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Hamtramck, a Polish working-class neighborhood where the rent was cheap and nobody asked questions. They sold the car, couldn't afford the upkeep, sold Constance's jewelry, Vernon's bicycle, most of their furniture. Constance took a job at a commercial laundry, standing 10 hours a day in humid heat, sorting filthy linens and operating steam presses. Vernon worked after school at a grocery store on Joseph Campeau Avenue, stocking shelves and sweeping floors, saving every penny for college. The worst part wasn't the poverty, though the poverty was grinding and relentless. It was watching his father shrink, watching the life drain out of him like water from a cracked vessel. Thaddeus had always been a vital man, energetic, principled, engaged with the world, always reading, always learning, always improving himself. He'd taken night classes in metallurgy at Wayne State, studied German so he could read technical papers, belonged to the American Society for Metals. Now he became withdrawn, stopped reading the newspaper, stopped going to church, couldn't face the neighbors who knew what had happened. Spent long hours just sitting in the apartment's tiny living room, staring at nothing, lost in some internal landscape of failure and regret. In 1946, Constance found him in the basement storage area one Sunday afternoon, going through boxes of old documents from the plant. Inspection reports, technical specifications, correspondence, all the paperwork he'd saved over 19 years. Papers spread around him like fallen leaves. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. Constance knelt beside him, took his hands in hers. But holding on was getting harder. By early 1947, Thaddeus had developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Deep, rattling, bringing up yellowish phlegm. The doctor at the charity clinic said it was pneumonia, probably picked up during his shifts as a night watchman in an unheated warehouse. Prescribed rest and antibiotics, penicillin, sulfanilamide, expensive medicines the family could barely afford even with Constance's and Vernon's combined wages. Thaddeus refused to go to the hospital. "We can't afford it," he told Constance when she begged him to get proper treatment. "Vernon needs that money for college. He's got a partial scholarship offer from Wayne State, but he'll need money for books, for living expenses. He's going to be a journalist, Con. He's going to tell the truth for a living. He's going to do what I couldn't do, speak up and survive. That's worth more than keeping me alive another few years." June 18th, 1947. The pneumonia worsened. Thaddeus collapsed at work, was rushed to Detroit Receiving Hospital. Vernon got the call at the grocery store, raced to the hospital on foot, arrived to find his mother in the waiting room, her face streaked with tears. Thaddeus Barnwell Holbrook died that evening. Pneumonia complicated by stress-related cardiac issues, the death certificate said. He was 45 years old. His final words, whispered to Vernon as the young man held his father's hand, were __quote _55 _____. Vernon promised. The funeral was small. Constance, Vernon, a few old friends from the plant who'd stayed loyal despite the risks, men who'd worked alongside Thaddeus for years and knew his character. No one from Detroit Precision Engineering attended. No flowers from the company. No acknowledgement that a man who'd given 19 years of his life to building their products had died. Vernon stood at the graveside in the spring rain, watching the coffin lowered into the ground, and made a silent promise to his father. Someday, somehow, Aldrich Morrison Cavanaugh would answer for what he'd done. The world would know the truth. 1947 to 1957. Vernon Holbrook put himself through Wayne State University, working nights at the Detroit Free Press as a copy boy, running galleys between the newsroom and the press floor, learning the rhythm of daily journalism. Graduated in 1951 with a degree in journalism and a minor in labor relations. Started as a cub reporter covering labor disputes and industrial accidents, the beat nobody wanted because it meant spending time in grimy factories and dingy union halls. But Vernon was good at it. He had an eye for detail, a talent for finding the human story behind dry facts, and an absolute commitment to accuracy that bordered on obsessive. His editors noticed. By 1953, he was writing feature articles for the Sunday magazine. By 1955, he'd moved to Industrial America, a respected trade magazine covering manufacturing and engineering, as assistant editor. In 1956, he married Ruth Kensington, a librarian at the Detroit Public Library with sandy hair and a quiet intelligence that reminded him of his mother. They bought a small house in Royal Oak, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a mortgage they could just barely afford. Life was good. Vernon was building a career, building a life, moving forward. But he never forgot. He kept his father's papers in a locked filing cabinet in his study. The termination notice, the grievance forms, the rejection letters, all the documentation of institutional injustice. Sometimes, late at night, after Ruth had gone to bed, he'd take out the documents and read through them, reminding himself, keeping the anger fresh, waiting for his opportunity. March 15, 1957. And now, after 14 years, here was Aldrich Morrison Cavanaugh's memoir on Vernon's desk, asking for a review. Vernon spent the entire weekend reading every page of An Engineer's Journey, Memoirs of Wartime Production. It was exactly what he'd expected. A self-congratulatory account of wartime production achievements, with Cavanaugh positioning himself as a decisive leader who made tough choices for the good of the nation. The prose was polished, professional, clearly written with the help of a ghostwriter. Anecdotes about meeting with military brass, solving production crises, inspiring workers to exceed quotas. The chapter on Quote 58 was particularly galling. Cavanaugh wrote about having to dismiss Quote 59. He presented it as noble sacrifice, a leader forced to prioritize national security over personal relationships, to make hard decisions for the greater good. There was no mention of safety concerns. No acknowledgement that the quote 60 might have been necessary to prevent disasters. No recognition that the people he'd dismissed were human beings with families and futures and dignity. Just smooth, self-serving prose that made Cavanaugh look like a hero, a titan of industry, a man who'd helped win the war through decisive leadership and unwavering commitment to production goals. Vernon sat down at his typewriter Monday morning and began to write. Not a review, a reckoning. The piece ran in the April 1957 issue of quote 61 under the headline quote 62 Vernon laid out the facts methodically, like a prosecuting attorney building a case. He described the April 1943 incident, the rejected turbine housings, the metallurgical defects his father had identified, the safety concerns that had been dismissed as obstructionism. He quoted extensively from his father's documented objections, providing the technical analysis that Thaddeus had submitted to the Army inspection team. He included excerpts from the Army's own report, confirming the presence of weld cracks and ordering full compliance with heat treatment specifications. Then, he detailed what happened next: the termination, the character assassination, the blacklisting that made re-employment impossible, the family's financial collapse, his father's descent into despair, the death at 45 that was as much murder as if Cavanaugh had pulled a trigger. He didn't write it as an emotional attack. He wrote it as investigative journalism, calm, factual, devastating. The article included sidebar documentation, photocopies of Thaddeus Holbrook's personnel file showing 19 years of exemplary service, the termination notice with its vague accusations of quote 63 quote and quote 64 quote, the grievance form stamped with bureaucratic indifference, hard evidence that contradicted every smooth sentence in Cavanaugh's memoir. The final paragraph read, "Mr. Cavanaugh presents himself in his memoirs as a patriotic leader who made difficult decisions for the war effort. But the documentary record reveals a different story. A corporate director who valued meeting quotas over ensuring safety, who retaliated against a quality control professional for doing his job, and who used his authority to destroy a man's career, livelihood, and ultimately, his life. This is not leadership. This is abuse of power. And 14 years later, it deserves to be called what it is, an injustice that has never been acknowledged, let alone rectified." The response was immediate and explosive. 3 days after publication, Vernon received a certified letter from Cavanaugh's attorney, a prominent Detroit law firm, threatening a libel suit for $1 million in damages. Vernon responded with a single sentence typed on his office letterhead, __quote _66 __. The lawsuit never materialized. Cavanaugh's lawyers, after reviewing the documentation Vernon had cited, apparently advised their client that a trial would involve discovery, depositions, testimony from former employees, all of which would make the scandal worse, not better. But other consequences followed swiftly. The Detroit Free Press ran a follow-up story. War production hero accused of personnel abuses. Former director faces questions about wartime management. The Associated Press picked it up. Within a week, it was in newspapers across the country, from the New York Times to the Los Angeles Times. Defense contractors who'd hired Cavanaugh as a consultant after his retirement quietly ended their relationships. Professional engineering societies that had honored him with Lifetime Achievement Awards began reviewing their selection criteria. Cavanaugh himself retreated from public life. No more speaking engagements at industry conferences, no more advisory boards, no more interviews with trade publications. He'd been positioned for a prestigious appointment to a federal commission on industrial safety standards. The nomination was quietly withdrawn. September 1957. Vernon received a letter. No return address, but the Detroit postmark and expensive cream-colored stationery suggested someone with resources and education. The letter was typed, formal, precise. "Dear Mr. Holbrook, I read your article about Aldrich Cavanaugh with great interest and, I must confess, considerable soul-searching. I was plant manager at Detroit Precision Engineering from 1945 to 1953. I want you to know that your father was not the only victim of Mr. Cavanaugh's management philosophy. During my tenure, I witnessed at least 7 similar cases. Experienced professionals dismissed for raising legitimate concerns about quality control or worker safety. In each case, the pattern was identical. Disagreement with Mr. Cavanaugh's priorities, followed by retaliation, followed by termination accompanied by a damaging personnel file that made reemployment in the industry nearly impossible. I kept quiet at the time. I had a wife and 3 children to support, and I convinced myself that speaking up would accomplish nothing except getting me fired as well. Your article has shown me I was wrong. Silence enables abuse. Silence makes us complicit. I am prepared to provide sworn testimony about what I witnessed, should you wish to pursue further investigation of Mr. Cavanaugh's tenure at Detroit Precision. I cannot undo the past, but perhaps I can help ensure the truth is fully documented so that others might learn from these mistakes. I cannot give you back your father, but I can give you corroboration. Respectfully, Lawrence Dunmore." Vernon sat with the letter for a long time, his hands shaking. Then he picked up the telephone and dialed the number that Dunmore had written in pen at the bottom of the page. Over the next 6 months, Vernon interviewed 15 former employees of Detroit Precision Engineering Corporation. The pattern was chillingly consistent. Cavanaugh didn't tolerate dissent, didn't tolerate challenges to his authority, didn't tolerate employees who put safety or quality ahead of production quotas. Engineers who questioned his decisions found themselves reassigned to meaningless tasks. Inspectors who rejected defective parts received poor performance evaluations. Managers who raised concerns about worker safety were accused of undermining morale. Some were fired outright, like Thaddeus. Others were pushed into dead-end positions until they quit. All received personnel files poisoned with vague accusations that made finding comparable employment nearly impossible. Quote, 69. Quote, 70. Quote, 71. Vernon compiled the testimonies into a comprehensive investigative report published in the January 1958 issue of Quote, 72. Quote, 73. The article made national headlines. Congressional hearings were convened by the House Committee on Labor and Education. The War Production Board's archives were reviewed, revealing multiple instances where Army inspectors had overruled Cavanaugh's production decisions on safety grounds. Decisions Cavanaugh had presented in his memoirs as examples of his bold leadership and willingness to stand up to bureaucratic interference. By March 1958, Aldrich Morrison Cavanaugh was a pariah in American industrial circles. His memoir was withdrawn from publication by the embarrassed publishing house. Organizations that had honored him, the Society of Automotive Engineers, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, his College Alumni Association, issued formal statements retracting or, quote, 74 their awards. The man who'd positioned himself as a hero of American wartime production was now remembered, if at all, as a cautionary tale about unchecked corporate power. November 4th, 1960. Vernon was at his office, editing a manuscript about new quality control methodologies in automotive manufacturing, when the call came. Ruth, calling from home, her voice strained and urgent. "Vernon, turn on the radio. The news. It's about Cavanaugh." He did, twisting the dial to WJR, the announcer's voice, professionally somber. Quote 76 __. Vernon sat down slowly. 14 years of waiting. 3 years of fighting. 3 years of investigation, documentation, exposure. And now Cavanaugh was dead. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no sense of victory. Just emptiness, like air escaping from a punctured tire. That evening, he drove to the cemetery where his father was buried. The November wind was cold, cutting through his coat, leaves scattering across the graves like lost prayers. Thaddeus Barnwell Holbrook's headstone was simple granite, 1902 to 1947, a man of principle. Vernon stood before it for a long time. "I got him, Dad," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the wind. "It took 14 years, but I got him. Your name is cleared. Everyone knows what he did. Everyone knows you were right. I kept my promise." But standing there in the cold, watching the sky darken toward evening, Vernon understood something fundamental. Vengeance didn't bring his father back. It didn't restore those lost years, didn't erase the poverty or the pain or the broken spirit he'd watched consume Thaddeus. Justice had been done, in a fashion. But justice didn't heal. Justice didn't resurrect the dead or repair shattered lives. It just ended things. 1965. Vernon Holbrook, 38 years old, senior editor at Industrial America, received an unexpected visitor at his office. A young man, maybe 25, carrying a battered leather briefcase and wearing the slightly threadbare suit of an academic on a modest salary. "Mr. Holbrook? My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, Department of Industrial Engineering. I'm researching the history of quality control practices in American manufacturing during World War II. I've read your articles about your father and Mr. Cavanaugh. I'd like to interview you for a book I'm writing." Vernon gestured to a chair. "What kind of book?" "About how American industry balanced production demands with safety standards during the war. The tensions between meeting quotas and maintaining quality. Your father's case is a perfect example of those tensions. He was technically correct about those turbine housings. If they'd gone into aircraft engines with those weld defects, we'd likely have seen failures. But Cavanaugh was under enormous pressure from the War Production Board to meet delivery schedules. Neither man was entirely wrong, but the system forced them into conflict, and the system destroyed your father." Vernon bristled, feeling defensive anger rise. "Cavanaugh destroyed my father. Don't give me moral equivalence. My father did his job. Cavanaugh abused his power. Yes, he did. And that was wrong. I'm not defending Cavanaugh's actions. But I want to understand why the system allowed it to happen. Why was there no effective protection for quality control professionals who raised legitimate concerns? Why did corporate directors have such unchecked power over personnel decisions? What mechanisms existed, or didn't exist, to prevent retaliation against employees who reported safety problems? How did the emphasis on wartime production override normal checks and balances? Vernon studied the young professor, serious, earnest, genuinely interested in the structural issues rather than just the personal drama. You're saying this wasn't just about Cavanaugh being a bad person? I'm saying Cavanaugh was operating in a system that rewarded meeting quotas and punished anything that interfered with production. Your father was an obstacle to meeting quotas. The system had no place for him, no protection for him, no mechanism to validate his concerns without disrupting production schedules. That's what needs to change. Not just punishing individual bad actors, but reforming the systems that enable and reward their behavior. Vernon granted the interview. Over the following months, he corresponded with Whitmore, providing documents, suggesting other people to interview, offering context and analysis. In 1967, Whitmore's book was published by MIT Press. __quote _88 __. It included an entire chapter on the Holbrook-Cavanaugh case, analyzing it as an example of what happens when institutional pressures override individual judgment, when corporate power goes unchecked, when workers face impossible choices between conscience and livelihood. The book became required reading in industrial engineering programs across the country. Thaddeus Holbrook became a case study, his name appearing in textbooks and academic papers, his experience used to teach future engineers about the importance of protecting whistleblowers and maintaining quality standards even under pressure. Vernon's phone rang one evening in early 1968. A voice he didn't recognize, crisp and professional. __quote _89 __. Vernon hung up the phone and wept, the first tears he'd shed since his father's funeral 21 years earlier. 1972. 25 years after Thaddeus's death, Vernon was now editor-in-chief of Industrial America, one of the most respected voices in manufacturing journalism, frequently consulted by government agencies and industry associations. He received an invitation to deliver the keynote address at a conference on industrial ethics at Cornell University. The topic: When Truth Costs Too Much, the Price of Integrity in Corporate America. Vernon prepared his remarks carefully. He'd told his father's story many times over the years, but this time he wanted to dig deeper, to explore not just what happened, but why it keeps happening, why every generation seems to face the same fundamental conflicts between truth and convenience, safety and speed, integrity and profit. He stood at the podium before an audience of engineering students, corporate managers, ethics professors, and union representatives. Began with his father's story, the facts he'd recited so many times they felt almost ritualistic, then moved to the larger pattern, the systemic analysis. My father was one man. Aldrich Cavanaugh was one director. But the dynamic they represented is universal, almost archetypal. Every organization, every factory, every corporation, every institution faces moments when truth conflicts with convenience, when safety conflicts with speed, when integrity conflicts with profit. In those moments, what happens? Too often, the truth teller is punished. The person who raises concerns is labeled a troublemaker. The whistleblower is fired or marginalized or destroyed, not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient, because they disrupt the smooth operation of systems designed to maximize output and minimize friction. He paused, looking out at the audience, seeing young faces absorbing his words, older faces nodding in recognition. I spent 14 years being angry at Aldrich Cavanaugh. I destroyed his reputation. I felt completely justified. He destroyed my father's life, so I destroyed his legacy. But anger doesn't create systemic change. What creates change is this: ensuring that the next generation of Thaddeus Holbrooks doesn't face the same impossible choice. Building protections for people who speak truth to power. Creating mechanisms that reward integrity instead of punishing it. Reforming systems so that doing the right thing doesn't require martyrdom. A student raised a hand during the Q&A session. Young woman, maybe 20 years old, with serious eyes. Mr. Holbrook, do you regret what you did to Cavanaugh? Do you think you went too far in exposing him? Vernon considered the question carefully, wanting to be honest. I don't regret exposing the truth. Cavanaugh's actions deserved public scrutiny. But I regret that I approached it primarily as revenge rather than as a call for reform. I wanted to hurt him. I succeeded. But that didn't prevent the next Cavanaugh. It didn't automatically protect the next Holbrook. If I could do it over, I'd focus less on destroying one man and more on changing the systems and structures that enabled him. Because institutions outlive individuals. Cavanaugh is dead. But institutions that reward production over safety, that punish whistleblowers, that prioritize convenience over conscience, those are still very much alive. 1980. Vernon Holbrook, 53 years old, semi-retired but still writing occasional columns and serving as a consultant, received a call from a young journalist at the Wall Street Journal. Enthusiastic voice, rapid-fire questions. Mr. Holbrook, I'm Diane Carver, working on a major investigative story about corporate retaliation against whistleblowers. It's happening across every industry. Companies firing employees who report safety violations, environmental hazards, accounting fraud, discrimination. The tactics have gotten more sophisticated than in your father's era, but the fundamental pattern is exactly the same. I'd like your perspective on how things have changed, or haven't changed, since 1943. Vernon spent 2 hours on the phone with her, sharing documents, suggesting sources, explaining patterns he'd observed over 3 decades of covering industrial affairs. The resulting article, a front-page story in the Journal that ran over 3 consecutive days, cited Vernon's work and his father's case as early documentation of systemic corporate retaliation against employees who challenged management decisions. 3 months later, Congress began hearings on comprehensive whistleblower protection legislation. Vernon was invited to testify before the House Committee on Labor and Education. He sat in the hearing room, an old man now, gray-haired and needing reading glasses, holding the same cardboard folder he'd kept since 1957. The documents inside yellowed and fragile, but still legible. Mr. Holbrook, the committee chairman asked, what would you say to someone facing the situation your father faced? Someone who knows they're right, who knows that speaking up is necessary, but also knows that it will likely cost them everything. Vernon thought about it carefully. I'd say, document everything. Keep copies of everything. Find allies, people inside and outside the organization who share your concerns. Don't fight alone if you can possibly avoid it. And understand, truly understand that you might lose. You might lose your job, your career, your financial security, your reputation. The system is often stacked against truth-tellers. But, and this is crucial, losing doesn't mean you were wrong. It means the system needs to change. And maybe, just maybe, your loss becomes the evidence that forces that change. My father lost everything. But his loss eventually led to reforms that have saved lives. That's not nothing. 1987. 40 years after Thaddeus's death, Vernon received a formal engraved invitation from Wayne State University. The College of Engineering was dedicating a new building, and they wanted Vernon to attend. He drove to the campus on a bright May morning, parked in the visitor lot, walked through grounds that had changed almost beyond recognition since his student days. The new building was impressive. Modern glass and steel, 6 stories, state-of-the-art laboratories and classrooms. As Vernon approached, he saw the sign being unveiled. __quote _100 __. Vernon stood at the dedication ceremony, surrounded by his family. Ruth, their 3 children, now adults with careers and families of their own. 5 grandchildren ranging in age from 3 to 15. A large plaque was unveiled near the building's main entrance, bronze letters on polished granite. In memory of Thaddeus Barnwell Holbrook, 1902 to 1947. Chief of Quality Assurance, Detroit Precision Engineering Corporation. A man who chose principle over security, who refused to compromise on safety standards, and whose courage in the face of institutional retaliation has inspired generations of engineers to maintain the highest standards of professional integrity. His sacrifice reminds us that technical competence without moral courage is insufficient, that engineering is ultimately about protecting human life and serving the public good. The Dean of Engineering invited Vernon to speak. He stood at the microphone looking at the assembled crowd, faculty, students, university administrators, representatives from engineering professional societies. Cleared his throat, began. My father never wanted to be a hero. He never sought recognition or martyrdom. He just wanted to do his job properly. To make sure that the parts leaving his factory were safe, were sound, would perform as designed under operational conditions. He paid a terrible price for that simple commitment to competence and safety. But his story has lived on. It's taught engineers about the importance of speaking up when they see problems. It's influenced whistleblower protection laws. It's changed corporate policies. It's saved lives. Lives my father never knew, never met, but lives that exist because he refused to stay silent. Vernon paused, emotion thick in his throat. Dad, if you can somehow hear this, you didn't lose. You won. It just took 40 years for the rest of us to catch up and recognize it. 1995. Vernon Holbrook, 68 years old, fully retired now, spent his days tending his garden in Royal Oak and writing his memoirs. The book was titled The Long Road to Justice, A Son's Quest to Honor His Father's Integrity. It was published by a university press, more documentary than bestseller, more historical record than popular narrative, but it found its audience. Professors assigned it in ethics courses. Corporate training programs used excerpts in management seminars. Book clubs and engineering communities discussed it. Vernon received letters from around the country. Engineers who'd faced similar dilemmas, children of whistleblowers, people who'd been fired for doing the right thing and wondered if they'd made a mistake. Each letter said essentially the same thing in different words. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 105, underscore, underscore. One letter stood out. It arrived in September 1995 from Detroit, from a young woman named Margaret Collins. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 106, underscore, underscore. Vernon read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Then he picked up the phone and called the number Margaret had included. Spent an hour talking her through resources, contacts at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, lawyers who specialized in wrongful termination cases, journalists who covered automotive safety issues. Helped her draft a formal complaint to NHTSA detailing the defect and the retaliation. 6 months later, the defective airbag components became a major recall affecting 3 vehicle models and over 500,000 cars. Margaret Collins was publicly vindicated. The NHTSA investigation confirmed her technical analysis, praised her courage in reporting the defect despite personal consequences. And she was thoroughly blacklisted. No automotive supplier would hire her. She ended up leaving the industry entirely, retraining as a high school physics teacher. But the recall, according to NHTSA's later analysis, prevented an estimated 17 deaths and over 40 serious injuries from airbag deployment failures. Vernon attended Margaret's wedding in 1997, danced with her at the reception, pulled her husband aside and told him, quote, 107-2002. Vernon Holbrook, 75 years old, in declining health with the beginnings of congestive heart failure, sat in his study surrounded by 5 decades of accumulated documents. His children, now in their 40s, successful in their own careers, had offered to help him organize his papers, decide what to donate to Wayne State's archives, what to keep for the family, what could finally be discarded. He opened the old cardboard folder, the one he'd carried for 45 years. His father's termination notice, yellowed and fragile now. The personnel evaluation that had destroyed Thaddeus's career. The letters to congressmen, to the War Labor Board, to the Union. All the futile appeals for justice that had gone nowhere. And at the bottom, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, a letter in his father's handwriting, dated May 1947, 1 month before Thaddeus died. Vernon had read it 1,000 times, memorized every word. But now he read it again with old eyes. Dear Vernon, if you're reading this, I'm gone. The pneumonia isn't getting better, and I know I don't have much time left. I want you to know that I don't regret what I did. I rejected those turbine housings because they were defective, because approving them would have violated every principle of quality assurance I'd spent 20 years learning and practicing. If I'd approved them, if I'd looked the other way to keep my job and protect our family's security, pilots might have died. Young men, maybe your age, maybe younger, with families and futures and dreams. Their deaths would have been on my conscience for however many years I had left. I chose to lose my job rather than live with that weight. Was it the right choice? I honestly don't know anymore. I've destroyed our family's financial security. Your mother works herself to exhaustion at a job she hates. You had to give up so many opportunities, so many plans. Maybe I was a fool to think one man's integrity matters in the grand scheme of things, that principles are worth more than practicality. But I want you to understand. I couldn't live with myself if I'd stayed silent. I chose to be able to look at myself in the mirror, to know that whatever else I am, I'm not a coward and not a fraud. That's all a man really has in the end. His own judgment of himself, his own sense of whether he lived according to his values. I'm sorry for the hardship this has caused you and your mother. I love you both more than I can express. I'm proud of you, Vernon, proud of your intelligence, your character, your determination. Don't repeat my mistakes, but don't forget my example. Sometimes the cost is high, but some things are worth the cost. Your loving father, Thaddeus B. Holbrook, May 17, 1947. Vernon sat with the letter for a long time, remembering that frightened 16-year-old boy watching his father's world collapse, watching strength turn to despair, watching a good man broken by an unjust system. Then, he took out a pen and wrote on the back of the page, __quote_, 109 __. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the folder with all the other documents, tied the faded ribbon. His daughter Jennifer came into the study. March 15, 2007. 60 years exactly after Thaddeus Holbrook died. Vernon Holbrook, 80 years old, confined to a wheelchair now but still mentally sharp, sat in the Detroit Historical Museum for a special dedication. The museum was opening a new permanent exhibition titled __quote _112 __. One entire section focused on labor struggles, workplace safety reforms, and corporate accountability. At the center of this section stood a large display case containing artifacts from the Holbrook case, the original termination notice, Thaddeus's personnel files, photographs of father and son, newspaper clippings about the Cavanaugh scandal, copies of the congressional testimony, facsimiles of the whistleblower protection legislation that cited the case as inspiration. The placard read, "The Holbrook Case, When Integrity Meets Power." In 1943, Thaddeus Holbrook was fired from Detroit Precision Engineering for refusing to approve defective aircraft components that could have caused fatal crashes. His dismissal and subsequent death at age 45 highlighted the extreme vulnerability of workers who challenged corporate authority during an era when employee rights were minimal. His son Vernon Holbrook's lifelong campaign to document corporate retaliation and honor his father's integrity helped inspire reforms, including the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989, that continue to protect employees who report safety violations and corporate misconduct. Vernon sat before the display in his wheelchair, holding Ruth's hand. She was 79 now, still sharp-witted but moving slowly. His children and grandchildren surrounded him, a multi-generational gathering that Thaddeus never lived to see. The museum director, a scholarly woman in her 50s, approached with a microphone. __quote, _114___. Vernon was tired. Speaking took effort now, his voice weak, his breathing labored from the heart condition. But he managed, speaking slowly and deliberately. Quote, 115. He paused, gathering strength. Quote, 116. He paused again, exhausted but determined to finish. Epilogue, 2015. Vernon Thaddeus Holbrook died peacefully in his sleep on August 3, 2015, at age 88. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press ran a full page with a photograph from his prime, serious face, intelligent eyes, a man who'd spent his life bearing witness. The text detailed his distinguished journalism career, his advocacy for whistleblower protections, his lifelong campaign to honor his father's memory and transform personal tragedy into systemic reform. At his funeral at Woodlawn Cemetery, the same cemetery where Thaddeus had been buried 68 years earlier, the president of Wayne State University delivered the eulogy. __quote _118__. Among the mourners stood Margaret Collins, now 48 years old, a beloved high school physics teacher with 20 years of experience inspiring students. She'd brought 15 of her current students, teenagers who'd studied the Holbrook case in their engineering ethics unit. After the service, she led them to the cemetery's older section, to the Holbrook family plot, showed them Thaddeus's grave with its simple inscription, then Vernon's fresh burial site beside his father. These two men, father and son, proved something important, she told her students. They proved that doing the right thing might cost you everything in the short term. You might lose your job, your reputation, your security. But in the long term, integrity creates a legacy that outlives you. Thaddeus Holbrook died at 45, broke and broken, thinking he'd failed. But 90 years later, we're standing at his grave, learning his story, honoring what he stood for. Vernon Holbrook spent 60 years fighting to clear his father's name and prevent similar injustices. He succeeded. They both succeeded. Their courage mattered. Their truth survived. Remember that when you face your own hard choices. Remember that what you do matters, even if it takes decades for the world to understand. The teenagers stood in respectful silence, processing the weight of history and ethics in human courage. Then, one of them, a quiet girl named Sarah Chen, daughter of immigrant engineers, asked, "Ms. Collins, is this why you became a teacher instead of staying in automotive engineering?" Margaret smiled, remembering her own moment of choice 20 years earlier. "I became a teacher because I realized the most important thing isn't building things. It's building people who understand why integrity matters. That's how you really change systems. One conscience at a time, one student at a time, one generation at a time." As the group walked back to the school bus, Sarah lingered at Vernon's grave. Read the inscription carved into polished granite. Vernon T. Holbrook, 1927 to 2015. He kept his promise. She stood there a long moment, the Michigan summer sun warm on her shoulders, thinking about the weight of promises and the power of truth. Then she whispered to the stone, "I'll remember. I promise I'll remember." And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever place the dead go when their work on earth is finished, two men, father and son, separated by death for 68 years but united in purpose and principle, finally rested easy. Their fight was over. Their truth had survived. Their legacy lived on in the students who learned their story, in the laws that bore their influence, in the lives that had been saved because they refused to stay silent. That was enough. That was everything.